Okay, colleagues, so first my apologies for not being able to spend the full 2 days, Bruce, especially to you and your team, and to Jenny and her team. We have a big conference on, hosted with the South African Council of Graduates, annual 3-day conference, which I had to attend yesterday, and I will be back there tomorrow as well. And it's always so great, even in the context of Sylvia's question, collaborations takes a lot of energy, but sometimes if you work with the right people, things fall together a bit more easier than in other spaces, but it's not something that simply falls out of the sky. And one has to continue working on those. And then what I see then emerging out of the 2 days here is exactly, something that, warms my heart as far as our own project is concerned that we are engaging with, and especially the contributions from the various colleagues, both the presentations and the colleagues from the floor as well. Amazing stuff, and you can't leave here unchanged, both in heart and in mind. That's fairly obvious. Now, when we had the project in mind, we wanted to stream it through this new area of higher education studies, which is not a very old area of study. It is less than 30 years old. And part of the work that we've been doing in the assessment of where the field of study has taken us, if you look at how the universities struggle to respond and transform globally, it did suggest that maybe there is something amiss within that particular field of study, even as new as it is. And so in those spaces, there's subfields that emerge, especially in the context of the South African ones on higher education transformation, and that subfield has been driven by colleges, especially at Northwest University. The question around studying the university had to do with the fact that the academy has always assumed a particular right to itself to study everything and everybody except themselves, you see? And that has been part of the challenges that the university has been facing, because through those kinds of orientations of the academy, they then assume a form of authorization of knowledges and a form of authorization of disciplinary expertise that then cuts out all other kinds of voices. So historically, this thing has been in the making for 1,000 years at least, in the way in which exclusion of knowledges has taken shape. Because the way in which those kinds of authorities then gets delimited within the context of the disciplines provide for a certain way in which the privileges are then distributed within the university sector. So in that particular way, we thought, okay, right, let's try and find whether we can't have a different angle to approach the study of the university, Something that has like an unruly streak to it, which we call critical university studies, where more or less all kinds of critique and criticalities are available to ourselves, and we take up the responsibility to pursue that. So the question of then, when we thought of putting together critical sustainability literacies and the Hubs of Convergence, and as an expression of that, we related back to the university's at least ambition, to become a socially embedded university in service of society. Of course, critiquing the notion of anchor universities, because anchor, dictates that there may be other people that are in need of being anchored, and that hierarchy, will be reproduced if we do it in those ways as well. Because an anchor university sees itself as a pivot around which communities, remains marginal, because there's a particular anchor and authority that the university then gets for itself, which is quite different from how Bruce and his team played out how the Hubs of Convergence emerged after the Vice-Chancellor, requested the engagement office to give life, I think there was only 2 or 3 sentences in the inaugural, but to give life to 2 or 3 sentences in the inaugural. And it's good to work in those ways so that people can run with ideas and pursue them in ways that they see fit and may work for the university. It has been amazing, in the way in which that has grown and the way in which it has established the university. There is certainly a national and a global interest in the university's work as far as its engagement trajectory is concerned. So that is an affirmation, as I always argue, into the council structures. That is an affirmation that the decisions that council have taken is working out in our practical space. The worry, of course, for me personally, but also both at the practical and at an intellectual level, was that the university sector has had a number of normative frames being imposed on it, over decades now. So for those of you who would know, there was the functionalist approach to the university. The university must make sure that is tied into the skills development project and workforce requirements of societies and countries. It should leave out these kinds of blue sky research that people have been accusing us of. That's the first one. The second one in the South African context has become the transformation project around the question of the big language of human rights, in the 1990s as well. So there, the university is then now seen as a university that will advance the constitutional democracy of South Africa, and in addition to that, of course, advance a culture of human rights. That's actually in the white paper, exactly as it is like that. And then we have had the idea of the university then becoming tagged into either a decolonial discourse, and of course, just after the decolonial discourse, into the SDG discourse. And all of them are normative frames, and in ways, try to dictate in what ways the universities should open up its different pathways. So the first objective then of the project was to argue that a university should not be designated. It should remain simply a university. A university that's designated as an SDG university or a human rights university is a university that by its designation is not able to critique its designation. And because it can't do that, it can't play a critical role, and therefore your critical literacies can't pursue that. So that's the first objective that we had in mind. And I'll also share with you the initial thinking when we were working on the proposal with Bruce's team, what came through in our cognition as to how we want this to play out. The second one would be the way in which the Civic University can be imagined via the Hubs of Convergence as an expression of those critical literacies. And the third one is the one that also came through strongly in Oyama's one, is the way in which some of this work then can relate into the realm of policies and different sets of practices. Okay, so we will have to write, perhaps in 2 years' time, a big program of learnings, for policy interventions, not only for our university, but also, for the sector as well. So the idea of what is critical about critical university literacies is, strangely enough, came from a very practical experience. So we have had the Constitutional Assembly in the early 1990s, constructed the interim constitution. We had those massive rollout, of course, setting up the structures that supports, democracy. And so, I started working at the Human Rights Commission, moved from Cape Town to Joburg in 1995. The big task of the new structures was to run workshops across the country, so we around about 500 per year, over a period of 10 years, running these workshops, rural areas, small towns, big towns, some international work as well. And so it gave rise to the question that what actually happened here in the Eastern Cape, in Mvezu, in a series of workshops. For those of you who know how we ran these workshops, you come in there and then you ask the participants what are the expectations. And then they write down the expectations, you write it down on the flip chart, and if those expectations doesn't meet your objectives, there's a flip chart that you call parking matters. Can you remember that? You park those matters, no? And then when the workshop is done, you try to fit those matters that have been parked into your original objectives. So your objectives have not shifted. You are literally disciplining what the communities are saying to you into your original objectives. So you haven't changed. Right? So when you ask, what is it that is the most troubling matter that you would like from this workshop? And they say, no, it is about the fences, of cattle, that it's a big problem. It's a question of IDs. It's feeding schemes in the rural areas for the schools and all those kinds of things. In your mind, you have to teach them about chapter 2 of the Constitution. Eh? So you start off the right to equality, the right to dignity, safety and security of the person, all those kinds of things. And after, spending time in rural South Africa, I knew that there is something wrong about what it is this workshop method is putting forward. And so we've done an analysis of 413 workshops over a period of time so that we can turn our assumptions inside out. And what I realized was that human rights more or less became like a religion. And then you then become more or less like a disciple of this religion, and you have to sell it. Doesn't matter what the communities are saying back to you about their understanding of human rights. And so that's my first worry, which then, when we got into the university space, I require as a powerful dogma, i.e., that whenever somebody challenges this particular frame, you respond to it through chapter 2 of the Constitution or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, okay? Not through the experiences of people. So that's the first thing about dogmas. And so when we then thought about, okay, right, a critical sustainability literacy should not be dogmatic about sustainability. In fact, it should have sustainability as its object of critique. That's why we call it critical sustainability literacies, okay? So it is not a dogmatic support of sustainability, although it may, in the broader parameters of things, support the objectives that the SDGs is trying to pursue. The second one is the academic democratic left. Now, in the 80s and in the 90s, we were always streamed according to political orientations. For those of you who know, you can either come through the union structures or through the UDF structures. But the long and the short of it is that within those structures as well, there was like a process of cloning, Like we have to become like one another, to be able to work together. That was also like a big worry, about how is it possible that one can hand over your independence into a program and project without being critical of that same project as well? And strangely enough, up till today, we still work like that. You are either in a particular kind of political orientation and you get cloned, and you don't have an option with regard to critiquing that very one. And then the last one is the grounding program at the University of Fort Hare. When I started working in the university sector towards the end of the 2000s. So Muthwa Tom recruited me after I left the Commission for Gender Equality to implement what we would call the critical consciousness module there at our university, and they call the grounding program. And that grounding program was designed by a group of students and lecturers, amazing. You know, Kim Porteous, of course, had the big designer of this curriculum. So you had a structure of umzi, ekaya, and villages, you know, and different numbers of students. And at the smaller rank of students, you know, 6 students per imizi, that makes up, you know, 30 students per ekaya. The 6 students, they were responsible for co-learning. That is that you can only hand in a group assignment if all 6 have worked together on the group assignment. If 4 hands it in, they have to argue why the other 2 can't be included so that you can take responsibility for each other's learning. And then you have this massive numbers coming through, you know, close to 1,800 students per year in that program. The great idea of this design was the fact that you actually had community elders around fire circles participating in the design of the program, okay? So the students go out into the communities and part of the design of the curriculum, credit bearing by the way, no? Credit bearing goes into that particular program as well. So pedagogy was then also turned inside out. So the way in which this then landed is that I thought that by the time when we started thinking about critical university studies and the importance of criticality in our work was the fact that none of our assumptions, doesn't matter how dear we hold them, should be at a distance from being questioned. We should not be so invested in our assumptions that we can't put them on the table to be critiqued. I have found in the human rights field that very difficult. It's very difficult to argue against human rights because everybody thinks it's such a good thing. You know, you will be, yeah, what is wrong with this person, man? And the same case goes for decolonization. You can't argue, you know, from a critical point on decolonization because people will tell you that you are not progressive enough. No? So those are the arguments that come, and that's why you don't get the debates. The SDGs became like that in the university sector, okay? The SDGs emerged as an uncontestable normative frame with a funding regime, networks, and power that streams the way in which we have to do our work. To be honest, in a sense, Bruce, we were surprised that the grant was awarded because, you know, the NRF is one of the agencies that drives at the SGdification of the higher education sector. The worry here is that you want a university to be a university, and that is to be critical of all normative frames, okay? And that was the way in which we then started thinking about critical sustainability literacies, okay? Because one of the things about the SDGs is that its assumptions of progress and development is not different from the Millennium Development Goals. It's still colonial and extractivist. If you go on that route, the planet will reach its limit in any case. There's not going to be the SDGs is not going to reverse the planetary damage being done over decades through the ideas of progress and development that we have bestowed on the earth. No? So there is now a sense that this thing that has caused the problem must not be the same thing that must save us, which is an oxymoron, you know, par excellence. The excitement about the Hubs of Convergence, of course, is that this is the way in which I think the value of the work should come through by critical sustainability literacies. Somebody must explain, where did the discourse come from that communities are in need of education on matters of sustainability? Who first thought of it? You know, it is survivalist forms of living has already sustainability ingrained into it. Part of the reason why, ways in which, in our university in particular, if you set up a discussion on decolonization, there's almost very little difference between a colloquium on decolonization and a colloquium on indigenous knowledge systems. They match together most of the times, at least 80%. Correctly so. Because the archival knowledge that are already resident within our communities for generations, and also the ones that they are producing anew, are actually the ones that will retune the ways in which we may think about the SDGs and the way in which we may think about critical sustainability literacies. Now, Yama also made a few of those remarks in her presentation as well, which goes in the same direction. There is nothing available in the knowledge formations of the world today other than community knowledges that will be able to drive back the planetary damages that has been done, over these years. So so there's almost like a sense that if you think of indigenous knowledge systems and community knowledges, that's actually the epistemic savior, that can provide some form of legitimacy to the SDGs as well. That's the one. The second one is that the ways, of course, in which that can work, and there's also 2 points that I've made here again from Oyama. The one is it is true that the knowledges can only emerge if we drop being tone deaf, because you must be able to hear if the knowledges, if the knowledges has to emerge. And I think that's where we need to do the work. The work is not that the knowledges does not exist. The knowledges are not being heard. Right? So that's the point that I wanted to make here. And then, of course, the vernacularization of Clifford's contribution also then comes in here as well. And especially I like the idea of, the vernacularity as the conceptual everyday, the collapse between thinking and doing. That is also what communities are doing. There's no difference between theory and practice. We have settled that debate already in the 1970s, okay? So I always find it very surprising when it comes up all the time. As if there is a body of people which is called the communities that is in need of theorization. That can't be true. That is a form of violence, actually. So the one is that the question around, and here again, our work must be seen on a spectrum, colleagues. So part of it is that criticality is a form of love. You love something so much that you invest critical thought into it. It is not a dismissal. Critique is not a dismissal. It's an act of fidelity, an act of loyalty to that project. If you don't like something, you would not even make space or time to critique it. You will just let it go, And so it's hospitable and it's expensive. And I always have had difficulty explaining this idea of critique because people always thought that it's a form of dismissal that you put on the table. But there is ways in which the SDGs can be rescued by a different type of angle towards the work that needs to happen. And of course, most of that, at least in our minds, reside within the experimentations of the Hub of Convergence. But in our university space, this is the point that Sylvia has also, we are sometimes prone to try to out-activist one another. Somebody wants to be a better activist than the other one, And of course, I struggle to find these things. Because now, I'm not so sure whether, some of you must have heard this very silly story about at the time of COVID when we did the food parcels, that some people were arguing, but why are you doing food parcels? You must do sustainable food systems. You remember that critique, Bruce? Eh? Now, how is that possible? If Oyama says hunger is the challenge here, you can't think now sustainable food systems. You have to have immediate relief whilst you build sustainable food systems. No? And so our work is always on a spectrum. And this is why we will have to work with love and we will have to work with generosity. Somebody that does a small thing around a food parcel and somebody that does scientific work on bean crop production, they're simply in the same space but on a spectrum. It's exactly the same space. No? And so I've always argued when COVID broke out, and we called that first meeting, in that meeting were white engineers. They were the biggest group in that meeting, already producing, safety gears and masks and all those kinds of things across the system. And then it's very difficult to come back into your meetings of activists, to tell them, but there are white engineers, and they are old white engineers, and they're running around, they're running around the city saving lives, so. Oh, okay, right. It was a very, but I must say that our portfolio was born in that fire, so it was actually a good thing that we were born in that crisis, because now at least, we work very well actually with all sciences. You see, I think Bruce sometimes say he works better with the engineers than with the humanities people do. And so that was the way in which one has to think about these things on that spectrum. Now, you can have beautiful critical work on the one spectrum, and you can have critical work on another spectrum, but they all try to contribute to do something good within the context of a crisis. Then the second one, of course, is that spectrum is not so different from Oyama's point around being a bridging space, né? The hubs of convergence being a bridging space. So if I want to put forward, say, a way in which, I would present, and this can be debated on how one should pursue the work, it would be the allowance of multiple conceptions of justice. So even if you think about the idea of social justice, you can cluster at least 20 sub-concepts into that same concept. But it must be multiple, it must be expansive. So that's the first one. The second one is the way in which we, at least in some form or the other, invest time in codifying community knowledges and practices. And codification not as a form of discipline, but codification as a form of making it legible into the university space, okay? So there's both legibility and there's coding. The one, sometimes they can lead to disciplinary domestication, but we have to be careful about that as well. And then what people do, of course, is more important than what people generally say they are doing, but then observation of what it is that people are actually doing. Nah? In our university, people claim a lot of things that they do, but even if you study yourself, you will find out, okay, what I'm saying about myself is not actually what I'm doing, So can we give you one example of this? Nah? So we have everybody says, okay, we're going to have digital transformation, and digital transformation is going to deal with the inequalities, in the learning and teaching space. All right? Fair enough. That makes sense. We can deploy technologies for good and for social justice purposes. But a study of more than 6,000 articles on what academics actually do between social transformation and digital transformation, the two concepts doesn't even connect across those 6,000 articles. Now, the one is on the one end, the other one is on the other end. Now, what is the lesson for us there? That if the two transformations are not connecting, if social and digital transformation are not connecting, of course technological innovation is going to lead to deeper inequalities. So that's the lesson, because the two are not connecting in our scholarship So obviously, it's going to raise these inequalities. And then the question about interrogative self-reflexivity. No? I must say I had a worry of reflexive studies for a long time because I had a sense that people do reflexive studies because they want to reflect themselves into innocence. So the reflection studies was not about the people with whom they work, it was about a redemptive exercise for themselves. That has happened especially in the 1990s. And that's why action research actually was more or less monopolized through white academics. It's now being taken back. But in the 1990s, it was actually used as a radical response to the apartheid regime as a form of reflection, got assimilated in the 1990s, and then of course, what people call fair lady methodologies come then through that particular work. So there needs to be like a reclamation from that work as well. And so the interrogative self-reflexivity is that one where you must reflect yourself almost into annihilation, where you can feel a psychic break in yourself. Because reflection has to do with delayering yourself. At that end, where that delayering discloses something bad, it must be annihilated. And even if that causes a psychic disruption, that's precisely where good transformative work happens. Part of the reason why transformative work in activist circles always stops short, just at that edge, where we have to stop short, is because of the fear for psychic disruptions, and then come back into the privileges and safety of the university. Okay, but because we can't give up those privileges and safeties, so we all are driven by those kinds of privileges as well. But there has to be a form of working amongst one another where we are better equipped relationally to support one another when we want to make those psychic disruptions within ourselves. And that is the true form of self-transformation, okay? From where everything else starts. So our ruling assumptions needs to be treated critically through critical sustainability literacies. So we have to ask ourselves, even with our own needs, what does our assumptions conceal? What does it protect? What ethics or interests are at play? What interests are driven by these ruling assumptions? And that's why we will have to give a bit more Jacobus, we will have to give a bit more value to negative emotions, like guilt, shame, complicity. Because the redemptive exercise can't happen outside of working with those. So one has to think of yourself almost in a sense of being a criminal, so that you can be okay with uncovering the bad in you, in your self-reflexive exercises, you see. And then from there, of course, then move. We've been trying to run away from negative political emotions because it's not comfortable. That's why, for instance, we can't, with colleagues across the cultural divides, we can't sit down and say, okay, how does the new South African dynamics make you feel around historical guilt and shame? We don't ask those questions. Right? We don't ask the question, across our cultural divides, how were our different kinds of ancestors complicit in both colonialism, apartheid, across the cultural divides? Right? Because in every person, the perpetrator, the victim, the beneficiary, and the bystander is always present. They just have different percentages at any given time. At any given time, I was a victim of apartheid. At any given time, I was a beneficiary of apartheid and a bystander and perhaps even a perpetrator. You see? So when history is then looked at so messy, of course, I'm not saying that the responsibilities are distributed equally. We know most who must carry the biggest responsibility. and the highest percentage of those, but nobody has clean hands. That's more or less the argument that I'm trying to, and because of that, we have a particular responsibility for a criticality that is also a criticality that is critical of ourselves. And then let me just end off by and I've shared this paper, and so sorry for this, you don't even have to read it, where I more or less make the argument just for a broader global audience, why I think it is dangerous for the university to have a lock, stock, and barrel adoption of the SDGs as a strategic orientation of the university without any critique. And so I needed to make it in a form that I made so that it can land up in the spaces where it should. But the one thing about the definition of critique is the one that it's the opening of categories to reveal the antagonisms within it. Now, of course, antagonisms is just another word for tensions. You know, a critique is to reveal tensions within oneself or within a process, and of course to disclose the crisis that that tension reveals. So if there's a tension, it tries to conceal a crisis, and then a critique is, of course, to make that crisis legible and, of course, also discernible for us as well. I've always thought that the fact that human rights didn't grow up with an internal critique was one of its major weaknesses. I see that same weakness with decolonization. It doesn't have its internal critique. And because it doesn't have an internal critique, because a critique is meant to grow you. It's meant to make you stronger. So it comes across as a dogma, and once something comes across as a dogma, it literally screens out the adaptive capacities that you should have for other people. Okay? And so, but if it's not a dogma, of course, it is acceptable in better spaces as well. And then the SDGs also comes across like that, as a form of dogma without an internal critique. And because of that, all three discourses are more weakened. And part of the work through Critical Sustainability Literacies is to find ways of recouping, you know, a critical attitude towards these discourses that are embracing of them, but not obsessed and not dogmatic about them, okay? So colleagues, let me leave it there and then we can, okay? Thank you so much for that, okay? Oh, Jenny said I must manage myself.
No, thanks, Andre, for that definitely provocative input. And I think so much valid points for us to learn as we do this work, I think in multiple ways. I like that you know, the one statement that you made, that we have to be careful that we don't get into a mode of self-reflexivity, almost to a point of pathology, where you can't move. So my question that I would phrase then is, so in thinking of different ways and different frameworks against the present frameworks of conceptualizing higher education institutions, from your vantage point as one of our leaders in the institutions, what are some of the key lessons you would start suggesting we should consider at the level of doing the work where we find ourselves that can really, I don't want to say accelerate, deepen, I think would be the word, deepen the processes of change that is truly meaningful in a way. So just based on those, I think the deep history of study of the particular field, but more in a contemporary way for young people that are eager, anxious to move the needle. What would you suggest through the HOC, through the different platforms, the young botanists, we can be doing more, and let me use the word then aggressively, to make sure that we support this agenda of real, contextual, constructive change that can not only influence our country, but influence our continent and then make a meaningful contribution to the global discourses as well.
Ponzo, and then
No, thank you so much, Prof. And I think thank you for your paper and of course the presentation. I think it gives us courage also to also be critical of ourselves. And I wanted to make a point, or perhaps ask a question in terms of: is it necessary to still categorize others as community and others as the university, which of course I think it still perpetuate the logic that universities are ivory towers, And of course, as you mentioned, in terms of the hierarchy, that these ones that we say they are from the university, they are the ones that comes and gives knowledge to the ones that are in the communities. While ourselves as a university exist within our communities, but there's this distinction between communities and universities. So I wanted us to also rethink in terms of how do we, refer, to these relationships moving forward. Thanks.
thanks. Oh, please. Mike, sorry, I didn't see you.
Well, I will be talking on behalf of the communities. Earlier on, I was just saying to myself, if maybe we have met with Bruce 20 years ago, I would not have been where I am. And nothing is late. I always believe that everything happens for a reason. As I am sitting here, the young ones are talking about fees must fall. And no one has spoken about why we never acquired academic qualifications because of 1976. Now, people often say history repeats itself. Now again, we are in the communities that we find ourselves in with scars of the past without even anyone who guides us in terms of achieving what we wish to achieve. It is now at the end of my years where I find myself within the universities. For an example, earlier on, someone was talking about research. In 2000, I met Credo Muthwa, and I introduced traditional healers with the microbiology and the biochemistry department of the same university. I worked with researchers. Unfortunately, I never got anything out of all the information that we gave. And now you say to me, I must work with the university, and I will ask myself, what is in it for me? Because the people that were students then are now doctors and professors. So, in a way, when we talk about these issues, we must be realistic. Again, I said earlier on, politics have played a very, very big role. As I am sitting here, I am seeing the face of the late President, Nelson Mandela. And earlier on, I was seeing Dr. Beyers Nodier. And now I am saying to myself, where are we? And if there was no hub of convergence, I was not going to be here. I am here now to say, before I die, it will be important that the little that I get from this kind of conversation and from this kind of the information sharing, those that are starving in our townships must be able to live for the years to come. Lastly, we are not telling our history. We are not telling our stories. As we talk about technology, we have kids who cannot read, who cannot write. Thank you.
Hi, Prof. You used the analogy of how the development of human rights was absent of self-critique. And you also mentioned, a couple of other examples where, like the SDGs, for example, they were developed. There's massive buy-in, whether it be from corporate, civil society, government, and the academic space into the SDGs. But there is emergence of critique around those SDGs. So similarly, how then do we do that process? And then maybe if you can just close the loop for me, in terms of what would then be the critique of what is accepted as a normative good. How then do we take it through that critique so that we can do that in all emerging spaces, if I'm making sense? Thanks.
Sorry, Prof, and my apologies if it doesn't come out as quite a rational question, because I'm still trying to formulate the issue. So you spoke about a model that Fort Hare looked at one stage. So my question is, it hasn't been repeated. Why didn't it work? Because the thing that worries me about the way we currently grant access to university is, and it worries me when I look at the stats in respect of the number of students that don't return for non-academic reasons. And so what worries me about it is that we take students out of their environment, introduce them into an alien environment, which we need to learn to navigate, as Winsley explained earlier. But the community and the environment comes with them, because a great number of our students are parents, so they're worrying about what's happening with children at home. They're worried about their families who don't have food and have made sacrifices for them to be here. And clearly, we haven't even been able to sort out the financial concerns of students, so we're not going to be able to ensure that they don't need to worry about the financial concerns of their family back home. So my question relates to how we grant access without alienating people from their communities and communities from the university.
Georgie? Oh.
Oh, thank you so much, Prof, for your rather interesting presentation. And I first asked for permission before I can ask this question, from two of my respected colleagues. So during your presentation, I can't help but think that during your presentation you spoke about critique. And you said that critique is a form of loyalty and fidelity to a thought, and that critique is not a dismissive gesture, right? My question then is, and this is usually prevalent in all environments, but especially prevalent within the university space, which I thought and believed that a university space is a space of learning, relearning, and unlearning, which is essentially the hubs of convergence, right, for the country. For me, I think in the context of criticism, criticism seems to be valid within the university space if there is a title attached to your name and a couple of published articles or journals. Within the university space, criticism seems to be from a top-down approach. It is never approached from the bottom up. Now I ask myself, as an emerging researcher, right, how do I then have the confidence to come up to an established researcher and ask critical questions or even critique them on certain critical aspects within the pedagogy without me being essentially called dumb or made to feel like I'm stupid for even asking that question? We were having a conversation prior to your presentation, and we kept on, with my colleague from Studies going, we actually spoke about that. When we were saying, in the context of Black African women, which is, I'm 33 years old, so I'm very learned in being a Black woman in South Africa, a Black African woman in South Africa. We don't have the privilege of seeking help or even being in a position of critiquing people, because we are always within the receiving end of the criticism. But when a Black woman criticizes anybody or gives out critique, valid or invalid, but I always say that Black women's critique is always valid, we are then labeled Black angry women. So you will forever be stamped as the angry Black woman, because you then chose to either stand up for yourself or do something that is essentially out of character for historical Black women, which for me is now begging to question what happened in 1956, Kanene? Because it was angry women, Black and all other colors, that essentially demolished the Dom Pass regulation that was there. That's why we are celebrating the 9th of August. So why now in 2024, when I have the privilege, rather, of sitting in one of the highest courts in the land, in a strategic place, being in a position of being called an angry Black woman, when I ask things that Section 2 of the Constitution speaks on? That's my question.
You can't burn down the Constitution for us.
No, you can't.
We will have to tie close them down.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Andre, for that provocation. You raise quite fundamental issues about what I think has to do with the university as we know it. And then this, in a way, raises to me a fundamental question in terms of the claims actually or positions that you have made. For instance, the current university is just a template that has been reproduced for centuries. And it's not as helpful as we hoped it would be. And imagine then what I call listening to you, a borderless university system that begins to ensure that all the other communities, stakeholders are willing and freely able to walk in and out, and into these institutions. But also it speaks to what you were raising about learning from the communities, so that the universities themselves can be able to unlearn and also to tap into those local knowledges. So if we are complicit as universities, all of us who work in these spaces, is there any realistic hope? I'm trying to, what Mike was raising earlier, is talking about the lifetime. Is there any realistic hope that we should be able to disrupt this template so that the next generation at least should be in a position to say, we are able to reap those benefits of ensuring that what I call this borderless institution is indeed a socially based institution. Thank you.
Thanks, George. I'm going to...
About to ask, but I think I'm going to ask a question that is along your lines, because I'm thinking with your presentation, Prof, I'm thinking like through the critical literacy studies, like how do we influence or how is it molding the emerging professionals? And I'm saying the emerging professionals because, Prof, as students, we come from a community, we go to the university, and the main idea that we understand before we get influenced by all the activities of the university is that I need to get my degree and be a professional. And then after that, we go back home after graduating, and then we still don't identify with our community. So how is the critical literacy studies influencing students or emerging professionals to better serve where they come from? Yeah, thank you.
Almost an entire thesis of questions here, colleagues. Now, can I get some time to end it in 3 years' time? Jacobus, you also want to ask a question?
You know, I'm sitting here, I'm listening to your presentation, and I am very inspired and I think motivated, but I've made some notes and I, you know, this is just an observation, but I think I will say, as you say, maybe there's a question somehow. It seems, you know, sometimes universities use language that is very loosely, and sometimes it is just to be politically correct, even at the expense of the most marginalized people of our nations, without considering the context where that language should matter the most. And Mike, you alluded to that. We're sitting with a large population that is illiterate, who cannot read or write. And this is what I said at my place of divine assignment with. We see plus 60% of learners who enters the education system never make it to matric. And then when they are required to pass matric, they are only required 30%. And 30% to me is not even enough to have access to the space where we set ourselves. It means we set people up to fail miserably and to become actually unemployed. The theme for this conference is critical literacy. However, critical may not be a priority. And we have to determine whether there's an urgency or whether critical literacy is a priority. In my context, when I hear the word critical, I respond. It changes my way of thinking. I respond immediately. When somebody said somebody is critical in hospital, I leave whatever I do and I run to hospital. But it will be different for me if I hear that, Cliff, your brother is in hospital, my brother is in hospital. I will respond differently. I will say, I will come tomorrow. But if it's mine, I will respond immediately. So I think that we should look at what critical means to us. Is it just a normal way of processing, or will it become something that is urgent? Will it be something that is just a standard process that we ought to follow, or will we regard it as a priority? My question, therefore, is, are there an urgency at the institutions that we love now today to change the narrative, or will it become a priority to us? It will, if we're just following processes, it may take another 1,000 years before it becomes transformative. It is my strong conviction then, if we are serious, Cliff, about this kind of transformation, Prof, we must be willing, and you mentioned those words, and I heard it another time, we must become willing and committed to engage in disruptive change, which requires radical faith. It requires resilient leadership and relentless compassion. That is who we are as an African. I hear this word African episteme. I don't even know what that word means. But because my people wouldn't know, if the people that I'm representing. But I'm closing now. I'm saying that we ought to consider, acknowledge, and include our root academics without fear or favor for the sake of our own identity and or even redemption.
Okay, I would need 5 years, okay, for this. This is just extended now. Colleagues, let me start with the last three set. Nah? The one is, there is a difference between criticism and critique, okay? So we have to get that clear in the way in which we will have to engage the question of critical, sustainable literacies, okay? So that critical has very little to do with criticism. You know, it has to do with enrichment, okay, analysis, interpretation, sophistication of thought, making things sharper in your head. That is what that critical refers to. And I think that, I'm not so sure whether I've done it in the paper, where I just make these distinctions so that it's clearer for colleagues to engage with. No? Because I think those kinds of conceptual slippages can trip us up. Okay? So that the question of critique as an act that is ontologically given to any human being doesn't result in being called an angry, you know, black woman, you know, because that should not be, that should be actually read as a form of sophistication and sharpening of the mind. But I must also say that the debate around the black angry African woman, yeah, I can give you hundreds of examples where that thing has already been clapped around, you know, and it doesn't get accepted in progressive parlance anymore. I think our African feminist has more or less settled that score, you know, on our behalf in many, many respects. So that's some great work pushing back against that particular idea of, you know, angry black African woman. I know, of course, in certain institutions, it may still be a big, you know, challenge to have. Then but the work is being done, colleagues. Eh? We have the Center for Women and Gender Studies here. We have the work of Pumat Gola here. You know, it's, you know, at the top edge of intellectual and scholarly work. That work has been driving at. So I just want to acknowledge that, the progress that we've made in those spaces. Then between George and you know, maybe George and Bruce's question, Bruce is now not here, around the question of, you know, conceptualizations for ways in which new work can become truly meaningful. And perhaps also to Wensley's earlier contribution. And of course I'm still working through it on many fronts. the types of universities that we are referring to as an ideal, they are already in existence in this bad university. So you have to think about a university, in a university, in a university, in a university, okay? You have a decolonial university emerging in this nasty university. You have an engaged university that collapsed the boundaries between community and university already emerging in this university. This is not a monolithic institution. It's a very, very complex institution. In fact, you can ask Bruce the kind of work that comes out of the woodworks once you bring colleagues together. And they are not doing it only now. They've been doing it for many, many years, that they've been crafting different universities within a university. That's why when the criticism comes as a sweeping statement, our responsibility is to sharpen our modes of analysis. That's our responsibility, okay? Because the idea of something that comes through a discussion like that already gives you an indication of the possibilities of the universities that are already in existence in different kinds of ways. You have an angry university, you have a simmering university, you have a new liberal university, you have a radical university, you have a decolonial university. All those exist within the same kinds of spaces. You have a university that responds well to student protest, and you have a university that responds badly to it. You have a university that responds well to indigenous students and a university that responds badly to it at one and the same time. No? That's the one. The second one is, Matilda, the point that you've raised, very structural actually, and it deals with the question that we have an inverted P-set system. Okay, so you have students that are coming to universities, you know, with a carrying capacity of 1.2 million, which should go into the colleges system, which has a carrying capacity of between 1.6 to 2 million. But of course, those colleges are not functional, and that's where our challenge resides. But the question around alienation, we should think of alienation as an ontological human condition, because we get thrown into strange places and different spaces every day. Somebody goes and gets a scholarship at Princeton University. Some people is going to say the person is going to get alienated from that particular institutional culture. The person that goes there and say, okay, this is a massive educational experience because I get disrupted from my normal engagement with things. That doesn't mean that the university shouldn't have cushions in place for indigenous students that comes to the university. You know, that is not what I'm arguing. I think a university should have that in place. I think, for instance, that our residences should be open from the 6th of January already, you know, for students that gets dropped off here with their bags. That has happened in many institutions where I work. You know, they get dropped off at your office, you know, because they know that you're a particular kind of person, and then you have to go and fight, of course. So the university needs to be responsive to that. And Wensley also raised some of those psychological anxieties that come through those spaces. But I want to have this thing about hope that George spoke about. And that is that the emergence of the different types of universities are there. No? That work is being done on a daily basis. You can look at the work that the Hubs of Convergence has been doing and the engagement office in the broader sense just over the past few years. No? So it's retuning the university's sense of it. But there is something that Mike said that we will have to take seriously, and that is, Bruce, if we can just make a note around the question of support into particular spaces of historical, what one can say, historical exclusions, you know. There was one case that the two of us also tried to, there was another case of a student who was over 60, whose mom worked at the old UPE, and was now claiming the kind of right to be supported, in a scholarly way because of his mum being a cleaner at the university at that time. We have tried to find a way of engaging with that, but it's of course, that's a very small example in the context of what Mike is raising, but it has the same logic, I think. Bruce, I've responded to your question, so that's the big one over here. Ponzo, I think I've covered that. Gajwal, then the critique has this, critique is not meant to work through, you need to hold it together. You walk with critique. That's why internal critiques of one's basic assumptions is always a good thing to walk with, because it's a checking mechanism, for the work that you are trying to achieve. So even if those critiques are emerging, like for instance, to give you an example that I think is manageable, if you have human rights training, you train human rights and then you train the critique of human rights in one and the same training. It's not, they are not in opposition to one another to such an extent that they should be excluded from one another, but they are enriching one another, and then of course you also give your participants different options to engage with it. The nice thing, of course, is that you also give your participants an option to think of it as an experiment in any case, and not as a closure of a debate, which I think is the kind of philosophy that also is within the Hubs of Convergence as well. And then the Ponzo, I think I've covered, and then Oyama, how is it influencing the emerging professional? So yeah, this is a very, but we've even had that as school teachers. I was a school teacher for 10 years. You don't engage with the community within which you teach. Jacobus, you also had those problems with teachers, of course. No? They fly in and they teach in areas. Bruce also had those experiences. And then, of course, they don't come work into the community back, but of course, actually, literally, they get distanced by university education from their community. Now, that is a deep question that I think we should probably spend some time on discussing as to how can university education, through critical sustainability literacies, result in students, instead of de-identifying with their communities, rather stronger identifying with their communities, you see. And so those short learning programs that's in Bruce's space, we will have to think about ways in which we can have an offering there that suggests that the university knowledges, because it does have a kind of alienating effect from communities. That's true. That's disciplinary knowledge. It's just designed like that, And so one has to systematically work against that if one has to play into the challenges that you are raising, Oyama. So I think, I'm so sorry if I missed something here. This entire page is fully written here. Am I sorry? Thank you so much. Yeah. Okay.
Colleagues, so let's give ourselves a round of applause for, I think, 2 fantastic days of critical engagement. And just as we're about to wrap up, the conversation that we had over the 2 days forms part of a bigger national research fund project. So I think, George, part of our legacy is to socialize what we can to create these spaces, to try and imagine the institutions we like. So, Nobala, when we talk about principal investigator, it's not a detective in the community looking for Mawetu. It's the person that's leading the grant, and that's Prof. Kiet. And myself and Jenny, we are then managing objectives in the grant. So the 3 of us are working to ensure the success of the one grant. And when we applied for the following. So now you must think, because I'm also a school teacher, can't teach for 2 days and don't ask you questions in the end. My question is going to be based on the summary now. Whether we've achieved the object, whether we also not achieved, whether we're on the right track. And if we're off the track now, where to, you must tell us, we're not that one. We think you must do better. Number 1, with Limerick University, we are starting to develop a community engagement qualification, similar to the one you heard yesterday. And already through the TVET conversation, SAQA is on board now, and they're willing to journey with us. So we want to become the first institution under this portfolio of Prof. Kit to have one, and the same criteria, passion for community, whether you're an A-rated professor or whether you're a GOGO, will sit for the course and then qualify around a project. So we are working with that, and in January, we will be spending time in Limerick with that. We also said that in this, with this grant, there'll be multiple forms of output, from academic papers to conversations, translating the inputs of everyone here in ways that's understandable for all. Okay? And already you'll see the different ways we'll share the information. We said that we're going to engage in various conversations, whether in Zwidi, whether at Doranginza, whether at Bronkhorstspruit, whether at Easter River, whether in Helenvale, whether in Bird Street, whether in Kucha, to make sense around how we formulate our strategy to support the transforming engaged university framework as suggested in some of our high-level strategy documents. And we've done this at local, national, continental, and global levels already. So we sparked those conversations, and that's feeding into some of the output you will see emerging. Then we also said we will have very specific project focus to deepen this understanding. So it won't only be through talking, it will be through actually doing the work that we will get then enriched and further deepen our contribution to the conversations around the Transforming Engaged University. We'll work with the Hope Revolution vision in rolling out its various sets of programs within the context that seeks to deliver a community-based response to substance abuse. We can say, PI, I'll call you PI because we have to report to you, that we also have from this conversation, our transdisciplinary team has expanded now to include our colleagues from botany and our colleagues from architecture. So with AMTC and others next week, there'll be a whole delegation. Now, this is what we mean with solidaristic reciprocity. While we're learning with one another, we're also supporting the growth. So as the Hope Revolution is supporting us, we're trying to understand the design of this model when we have to deepen ourselves wherever we find. And so we look forward to the report we'll receive from those colleagues. But we've overextended already with our grant because we committed to work with 3 organizations. George, we must just get to your institution still with the HOC. We've already now, with colleagues at, I think it's 5 or 6 institutions, Amy Oyama, that have embraced the design and methodology as a model of exploration under this grant, mobilizing around different points. So at Stellenbosch, we're working with your postgraduate psych students. At CUT and Free State, we are working with the engagement units. At MU2, we've been invited next year to co-construct with them a different model. But I think, Cliff, we celebrate that the design allows colleagues already an entry point based on our learning as well. So there's quite extensive work that's been done. And now we're excited about the national project that everyone will be mobilized around the Hope Revolution vision. We've also committed to food systems, especially student hunger. And we're excited under the leadership of Amy the work that has already been done, and I just was eavesdropping, and I've been battered here because I've called people angry black women. My apologies. My soul was good, but my words were bad. Colleagues have already organically made relationships, and already the colleagues bought those those intellectuals, those deep intellectual thinking about the seed and the work now in food systems and bringing those knowledges. And yesterday with architecture was beautiful just to see the opportunities that will be blinking. And then Mike, you'll be happy to know that as part of the indigenous knowledge system, there's also commitment here to deepen and understand the frameworks for support for indigenous knowledge systems. And under because Mike leads the delegation on the Mandela Bay traditional leaders, we will include the one that Prof. Keet identified, the historical exclusions. So it's both me and your responsibility when we get conversation to make sure that's on the agenda. And we also like to, Prof. Keet welcome these two younger gentlemen from the Khoi and San Magta's original group as the youth that has now taken up the spear to learn from the ancestors, but work with us in ways that will further deepen and drive our work. And then through the research, we've also created employment. Employment internally for our graduates that can do research, and employment externally for what we are terming now community engagement practitioners. We also write in new job descriptions through this grant, and it will be wonderful to think carefully when we report the justification for why we did it. But you see, we have bodies of empirical knowledge now that can really even challenge the paradigms. And I think that's what I would also add as a conclusion, that although transformation will be about thinking carefully, it also requires boots on the ground. And boots on the ground does not necessarily mean every time or one form of boot on the ground, rather can then also be a real head-on confrontations with those oppressive systems, even at higher education institutions, that can possibly delay the speed of change as well. So I think we're making a substantial contribution already, and we're quite excited moving into next year. So now, this is your time to report back to the teachers, or not teachers, we were students together for 2 days. You must either say, we think you're on track, and you need to consider one thing, and everyone must speak, including the cameraman and those people that came for lunch now, the last few minutes of the 2 days. We're on track. If you're on track, we want one word that would describe your experience over the 2 days. If you feel we're on track, I'll be with you now, Mike, okay? One word. No preambles, no manifestos, no corrections, one word. If you feel we're off track and you think there's something urgent we should consider, you got 30 seconds to say what it is we should be mindful of. Are we all okay? Must I repeat? Should I repeat? If you have nothing to say, you say sharp and we'll pass you. Just say sharp. We still love you. So you might have been 2 whole days here. You might have come today. You might have just popped in now. But from your vantage position, and we want to hear from, no one is excluded, from collecting the sound, from recording us, from sitting on your phone the whole day when you're watching the thing. You have a vantage position, okay? And we won't allow state parastatals to run away when they must speak, okay? So, Mike, you have a question before, or do you want to be the first to respond, and then you say left or right and we develop a flow? Mike?
All I want to say, the university is on track. And I always believe that if you start small, you have a room to grow big. Thank you.
Left or right, Mike? Ne? Remember the others? Just because Mike has been previously marginalized and not recognized, he's the only one that was allowed to give a sentence. No, give it back. You start with it. Mike, to your left or right? Okay, it's you, bro, with the mic. You must go next. One word, Oh, come. One word that will describe your experience, and whether we're on track or if you have nothing to say, you say sharp.
No, sharp.
Yeah, Buddha, come here. Yeah, the guy that always brings bad.
Can I say a sentence, if it's fine?
Unless you're going to add something extra.
I think it would be a...
Sure.
Yeah, so for me I would say knowledge is power, but wisdom is the ability to apply that power. So in all that I've learned this week, even though I was sitting recording, I could say there's a lot of improvement, and it's also very constructive as well.
Just because he decides the shape of yourself, no one else can do what he did now. One word. Okay. Wensley.
Ownership.
Cliff.
Tension.
Tension. The photographer ran out. Don't, it's okay, we'll get him when he comes back.
No thanks.
We won't interrogate no thanks. Self-reflexivity, hyphenated word, so not 2 words.
Challenging.
Challenging. Yeah. You just pass it forward and you go.
Good day. I would like to check on the university if, since it's surrounded by also with other institutions, do somehow able to invite colleges. For example, I come from P College. Some engagements that are being said here affect us also in the college. So I would like to know if, are you able to allow us to also invite you to assist us on other things?
Just because he's a guest. Others are one word. Yes, most definitely. Please invite us. So it's your responsibility. Don't say we don't come to PE College. If you don't invite us, it's going to be your problem because we said yes. Victor, one word?
Thought-provoking.
Thought-provoking. Krishna?
Fulfilling.
Fulfilling. Jenny?
Angry.
Angry.
Energizing.
Energizing. Pastor?
Knowledge enhanced.
Behind you?
Sparking.
Sharp.
Sharp.
Social justice.
Informative.
Intriguing.
Behind.
Sharp.
Revolving evolution.
Hope. Thought-provoking.
Rev.
Inspired.
Excited.
Eye-opening.
Opportunity.
Innovative.
Interrogative.
Let's just give to...
Don't forget the scars of the past.
Trust Stellenbosch to invade on the space. Go.
We are guests, I'm joking. Invigorating.
Work.
Influential.
Canonical.
Stretched and capacitated, but still under construction.
Transformative action.
Word.
One word, tension.
Tension. Excellent. One behind you.
I'm tired of hearing it.
Jean. Okay. It's the longest word. I don't know how you spell that word and this one. Then, colleagues, just let's give the organizers from the office an opportunity. Just give them a nice round of applause for a well-arranged event and all the work. So, Jenny, just express our appreciation to everyone in front and behind, Pesta, that was responsible for taking care of us and arranging the space for to have the conversation. Then, as we continue to extend, remember there are no more events in our work. There are connecting processes. Prof, Prof is also the acting VC, so when you were said, where's Wensley, when you said the VC must stand in the showers, that was meant to all to take a cold shower now during the winter. So we at Stellenbosch University, in the room, Mike, we had masters and PhD students from Stellenbosch. We had lecturers from Stellenbosch, from Mandela University, from UWC, from Mangosuthu University. We had students from Mandela University and Stellenbosch. We had the Hope Revolution members that some of them have reformed. I'm struggling still with vocabulary because we're also thinking about better vocabulary because labeling is also not good. But gangsters that have, high-level gangsters that are now working to claim back communities in the space. Prostitutes, people, homeless people, a constituency that we at Hubs of Convergence, we never thought about as a constituency. And out of those conversations and visit to the Eerste Rivier, the artists suggest for this collaboration, and we're calling this an output, that this represents the power of pulling together. But it requires our fingerprint on each in the pulling together. And you'll see there's no one's fingerprint here. Show me who has a PhD on this fingerprint. Can anyone see a PhD fingerprint? You just see fingerprints, and that fingerprint was a willing commitment. And this we want to now officially hand over to Mandela University, that will hang this in our portfolio so that we're reminded, and when we do that final reflection, that how we have done. And symbolic gestures are important. So in building and strengthening the continuity of what we've established in Stellenbosch, we now revert to Mandela. And I'm going to invite now the state-owned enterprise to join us here as a new stakeholder whose fingerprint is not on here. I'm going to invite one of the youth, you decide, from the Koi and Son to come take a picture with the acting Vice Chancellor. Poncho, I don't know who you're representing, but you're Mandela already. I want to invite our colleagues from the botany. That colleague from the botany, please come forward. You identify one person to come forward, please. Mike, come forward as the Mandela Bay traditional leaders. I'm going to invite Jackie as the CEO from the Hope Revolution Vision to come forward. Mawetu, sorry, you and Nobala decide who's going to come forward representing all the organizations around the metro. Nominate one person. Matilda, you from the law clinic, please come forward as well. One of those three gentlemen sitting there, decide who's going to come. You formed a new constituency. Just decide who's going to come. George, can you please come forward as well? And Victor, we're still trying to schmooze Aeon to our space. Rev, can you just come stand in front and the rest must stand behind? I'll go sit so that we take a photo. And then you officially hand over the first of many outputs, or the second or the fourth. I just want Rev to hand it to you and you can take just please stand around, Prof. Keita, make sure. Can you just hand over and say yours? And remember, although we are critical, we also appreciate the space that has been given to us to do this work. In many institutions that we have the privilege of moving around, people are envious about the amount of space and resources we are given to do this work. So please, even as we are hypercritical about some of the practices, we also celebrate the amount of opportunity that we are given to do this work in a meaningful way. So I'll allow Rev now to say a few words of encouragement to our leadership and hand over the first, or the output.
Colleagues, we are deeply grateful today for this wonderful opportunity, and Prof. Keert, we are humbled to be in the space and that you allowed us and invited us into the space. And there was somebody that mentioned a word, ownership, and if we moving forward and want to see the progress that we so desired, we need to decide before we leave from the space today whether we want to be a member of this movement, because members do as they please, or whether we want to be partners. Partners only meet goals and objectives, and we have a tick box exercise. But when we become owners, we go beyond the call of duty. It's no longer just the responsibility of the institution, but we have committed ourselves to come alongside and make sure that this process in our lifetime, if it's not being completed, that we will see significant progress. And I want to say, as President Paul Kagame said, we can't fix an Afrocentric problem with a Eurocentric solution. Let us as Africans take responsibility for this nation and the nations of this continent. Thank you. Prof, God bless you.